Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now what I've got whizzing around in front of me today are Australians, and I have fairly recently painted Chindits for the British Army, which are in a very similar uniform, but because these guys are slightly different, and importantly a different range of miniatures, I thought it might be interesting to tackle them in a slightly different way to show you that you've got some options. Now these have come courtesy of Medbury Miniatures' latest Kickstarter, which I will make sure to link to in the description. I was very kindly allowed to have a couple of these guys to have a play around with, and I've thoroughly enjoyed myself. They printed off beautifully. All of the details for that will be in the description, so go check it out. When this uploads, there's a little bit more than a week remaining on the Kickstarter. It has slaughtered all of its stretch goals, so if you're looking for pretty cool miniatures at a reasonable price, go check it out. So, as always, all of the paints for this one will be listed in the description below, so let's get started. So before we jump straight into the painting, let's have a look at the miniatures themselves. So quick note on these are from, well, they're actually a team-up between Medbury Miniatures and Victor Perry at Adventure Miniatures. Now Victor is a huge collector, a fellow with a marked interest in the Australian contribution to World War II, and this is something that he actually commissioned the first handful of these miniatures from Andrew over at Medbury Miniatures, and they've gone to Kickstarter to finish off the range because they're very cool. The miniatures themselves are wonderful. I've got another fella here primed up that I'm going to have a go at painting too. The proportions on them, they are designed that they're going to be cast in white metal too. So if you want to check out the Kickstarter, you can see the prices there. They're actually bonkers good for a metal platoon if you're into that sort of thing. But I really like this slightly old school, they are metal miniatures. Now these two are 3D prints despite that, but they are the same proportion as what the metal guys are going to be. So you get a pretty good look at them there. I do love, there's just something about the way stuff is done with an eye to being cast in metal that really works. The details lifted off of the shirts and what have you a little further. They're lovely. They are really nice miniatures. So I'll pop this guy aside. For a size comparison, if I make sure that those bases are side by side, you see they are ever so slightly shorter, I would say, than the Warlord plastics, which isn't necessarily a terrible thing. They're probably closer to true scale for 1/56 scale miniatures, but the proportions on them are not so different that I think they'd look weird in the same army. That being said, the metal Australians from Warlord are absolutely titanic. They're even bigger than these guys. So I don't think these smaller fellas would fit in with the metal Aussies. All the same, if you are getting the STLs, you can change the size of them a little bit and get them to fit what you'd like. I think with proportions like these, they'd probably scale down to 15mm pretty well. The bayonets are nice and chunky, so they're going to paint up well, but they'll also still have a bit of heft to them if you make them smaller. All the same, all my stuff's in 28mm, so these are perfect. Now let's crack on with the painting. So as far as priming this fella, I've started with Skeleton Bone from the Army Painter, but any mid to light, either grey, honestly, or a bone or beige sort of colour will work quite well. I've chosen beige because it's going to work, I think, better for most of the colours that we're going to apply over top. It will also add just a little bit of warmth to the greens that we're going to use, and as I talk about that, you'll see why that is. So I've got here on my palette a little bit of Ruddy Umber and just a tiny wee bit of water in my brush as I mix that in, and then we're going to start with his skin. Make sure I've got him in shot there. I always figure it's easiest to start from the places where you're most likely to make a mess, and faces tend to be one of those places that are a little bit tricky to reach. So all over his skin, this will probably take a second coat to make sure that we're not getting any of the primer showing through. And when it comes to the uniforms themselves, they would originally have been khaki drill, which is actually not too far off the skeleton bone that we've already primed this guy with. But these were dyed en route, and there is kind of a legend. I haven't been able to find out whether or not this was 100% true, but supposedly there were uniforms that were being dyed on the boats while being shipped over to Guinea, and they were showing up still damp, which is kind of cool, even if it's not 100% true, but it also might be. So what I'm starting with here, this is green-gray from VALLEJO. And what I'd suggest to you is that you don't get too hung up on what is the correct color for these greens, because of course, if they are being dyed en route, and they were dyed khaki drill initially, so go with whatever you like the look of. Green-gray does have a slightly kind of faded look to it once it dries. So I kind of like it for uniform that's seen a bit of wear. So this fella's probably been in the jungle a little while. For a shirt, what I'm going to use is Russian uniform. And this is a really good sort of generic army man green. It is a little bit more vibrant. And it's got a tiny touch, it's a slightly more olive sort of color. So a little bit of yellow in there too. I would suggest if you wanted to paint all of the uniform one color, this would probably be my choice for that. But remember, of course, we are dealing with dyed uniforms that saw wear, tear, they were washed, they were wet and damp and grimy and dirty. So there really isn't a correct green here. Just use whatever you think looks cool. Now the hats, strictly speaking, English uniform would be closer to the actual color they were, but these faded incredibly quickly. So what I'm using instead, this is US Field Drab. Helmets, likewise, would have been painted fairly quickly upon arriving in theatre. You could use the dark sand if you want that lighter yellow colour, but I would suggest to you that refractive green is going to be more accurate. Though you would still sometimes find bottles where this is called retractive green instead. Now for his webbing, I've got here dark sand, and this is going to go over his pack, straps and what have you. Now, this will cover relatively well if you've used like a beige or a skeleton bone sort of primer, but you will still find for a solid color, this is definitely going to need 2 coats. I should have mentioned earlier, I have also used flat brown to paint in the cover on the water bottle. But what we're going to move on to now is if you've got a sharp eye or you're a fusspot for gear like me, you'll notice he's actually wearing US-made gaiters. And that's because they were much better for the jungle conditions than the little anklets were. So these are getting a quick blast of German Camo Beige, same as they would if an American chap was wearing them, because they didn't blanco these. And we'll finish off his boots here with leather brown. Now this is the model color version, not the game color version. They are quite different to one another. This is more of a deep chocolatey brown. And the game color one looks quite similar to the Army Painter's leather brown actually, maybe just a little bit more yellow. Now before we get to any of the harder details, like his bayonet, scabbard, the Owen gun, or the rifle on the other fella, what we're going to do is to dry brush the whole miniature. Now if you've seen me do World War II stuff before, you might have seen me use dark sand, which is pretty good. It will work quite well on this fella, but I do want something that will pick out the dark sand we've used for his webbing. So what I'm going to turn to here, this is Ancient Stone from the Army Painter. I'm going to pop just a little bit of this on the end of my brush, and then work it back and forth into a bit of kitchen towel. Now, some folks will say don't use kitchen towel because it'll give you a chalky finish to your dry brushing. Short answer is nah, and also if it does, I kind of want it to, because we are doing a faded uniform here. So what I'll do is start at the back here, across his pack, and as I go over it a couple of times, you'll see we start picking out the edges with a little bit of that ancient stone. Now, this will also work for the other faded colors we want for his uniform. So go light at first, just the tiniest whisper of it, until you see where your brush is catching. And when it comes to applying this, you can be a little bit more generous with it than you might think, because we're going to shade these dudes, and that will bring these colors together a little. That's part of the reason why I'm using Ancient Stone, is because it's got just the tiniest bit of warmth to it, so it will work over yellow, faded green, even skin, if we end up with a little bit of it on there. That's not a problem. So I'm now going to dry brush, lightly, the whole miniature, trousers, gear, everything. You'll probably notice I have gone back to some of that helmet color to touch that up. I would probably do the helmet after having done this step in the future. I'm also going to tidy up a little bit of the skin because it doesn't need to be quite that pale. With those little bits of tidy up done, we can start painting in the bits that we don't want to have that softer edge from our dry brush. So I have here flat brown, and this is going to be our wood color. So this is going to go over the rifle. I might have thinned that down just a little bit too much. And as well, I'm going to go straight over the handle on the bayonet too, because these tended to be quite dark. And for any parts that are going to be black or gunmetal, what I have is German grey. Now this is a very, very dark grey. It's almost black when it dries, but it has just a tiny wee hint of blue to it. And not being a true black, when we shade it, the recess is going to take a little bit as well. So over the Owen gun with this, likewise the black parts on his rifle, or the other fellow's rifle rather. And the very last of our base coats we're going to apply is a little bit of gunmetal from the Army Painter. Any middling sort of silvery gunmetal color will work here just fine though. The bayonets, they're pretty wicked. And once that has had time to set and dry, what we're going to do is shade our fella. Now what I've mixed up in my little well over here is equal parts of strong tone, soft tone, and the Speedpaint Medium. And the reason for this, pretty simple. I want the shading that the strong tone is going to give us, but I want it to be a little bit warmer, and that's what the soft tone is in there for. And then finally, the Speedpaint Medium is to make sure that it doesn't stain any flat areas quite as much as it would if we were to use this neat. So I'm going to be relatively careful in my application. We are covering the entire miniature with it, but I don't just want to chuck it straight over the top and let it settle completely randomly. You'll see as I'm applying it, once it's had a couple of seconds to settle, I might come back with my brush and shift it around, put it somewhere I want it to be, or take it out of any big clumps. But that is why we practice this. Once I've got this over the entire miniature, I'm going to leave them to dry somewhere warm, give it about half an hour, and see what we have. Now once those are dried, we've got loads of shading. And I think you'll see as well that it has pulled in that dry brush a little and made it look much more like part of the color underneath. So even though it's relatively simple, I think that dry brush does add quite a lot to the texture of the miniatures. And then the shade brings everything together. Very cool. It does dry with just a little bit of a sort of satin sheen to it, but we're going to matte varnish these guys as a final step anyway, so it doesn't matter one bit. What we are going to do is just a couple of highlights. I'm going to start off here with some Cadian flesh tone, in the grand old tradition of painting skin differently in almost every video. So what we'll do is we want to cover most of the skin and leave the shaded recesses behind. So particularly up on his face is a good example. Here what we'll do is fill in his cheeks. Yeah, the big line crease down the side of his face, his neck and what have you. Take your time here, and it does help to have quite a long brush with a decent point to it so you can jam it in there. Now while I was doing that, I did sneak in and paint in the eyes. It's not something that I would ordinarily do with these fellas, but I figured it was going to add a bit. Now I have done a video on that specifically, which I would suggest go have a look at that, because unfortunately I left it a little bit late in these guys, so I just kind of had to go for it. But there is a much easier way than how I did it, so I'll link to that in the description too. What I'm going to finish off the faces with is a little bit of Kislev flesh. So this is now concentrating on the high points like his cheekbones, nose, top of his lip and what have you. Alright, now I'm going to spin this fella around, because you'll see there's quite a lot of the back of his head here. So what I've done, and this works pretty well for all sorts of colours, so don't think you're going to use what I have, which is hardened leather. It's a speed paint, and I've thinned it down about half and half with water. I'm going to get a little bit of this on my brush, and then we'll basically just use it to glaze in the back of his head, enough that it looks like there's a little bit of hair growing back there. Now once this is dried, what I'm going to do is take him outside to hit him with a matte varnish. And then I want to show you one other thing we're going to do to polish these guys off. And what a difference a good varnish makes. What I'm going to do is grab here, this is a 2B pencil. The softer the better, and just use this to buff the edges of some of the metalwork so you get a nice, realistic looking sort of edged gunmetal without having to get in there with a brush. Once I'm finished with this, what I'm going to do is go ahead and pop the bases on them. And the recipe for that will be in the description. So let's get a look at our Aussies once they are all finished. And so there at last, our Aussies are complete. And these were a lot of fun to paint. It's worth pointing out, as always, to mix around the greens that you use, have a bit of an experiment with what you like the look of, because what I've given you here is just one potential solution. In particular, US Dark Green is another really good Army Man green that works for pretty much everything. Yeah, see what you like the look of, because there is definitely more than one way to do this. I think the dry brush is a nice quick way of getting a fair amount of extra detail onto these guys. I think I might have been better served by maybe going slightly lighter on the packs, but that's up to you if you want to give that a shot yourselves. So again, thanks go to Andrew and Victor for letting me have a couple of these guys to have a play around with. I went and backed it pretty much immediately because, yeah, what I need is more STLs. I need more armies to paint here. So as well, thanks go to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of my wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, and very importantly resin in this case, such as my glorious producers who are showing up on screen. Really appreciate the help, folks. Now, any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Blue Sky and Instagram are both linked there too. So, thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.